Hello all, welcome to our presentation, College Counselling Information Session called Crossing the T's. Basically, we're going to be looking at standardised testing, what's the environment like in 2025, SAT, ACT, LNAT, UCAT, IELTS, what are all of these? We're going to be looking into these and hopefully giving you the knowledge that you need to make you feel comfortable about what's required from you in the application process next year. So here is what we're going to cover. We're going to very briefly give you a brief overview of the SAT and the ACT with some resources, how the SAT and ACT are being used in universities in the US, the UK, Europe and other places around the world. We're going to have a brief look at the standardized test that you may see. Just a little note, this is not an SAT, ACT preparation session. This is designed to help you understand how these tests are going to be used in the application systems that you will be doing next year in grade 12. So what are standardized tests? If you look on the left, we've got the US there. It refers to any external assessments, which include the SAT or the ACT, and any tests that students may take in the final years of high school. Sometimes in the US, they may be referenced to curricula like GCSEs if you've done that in the previous school, or IB, or AP, or A-levels, etc. So they could really label standardized tests as any of those. Now, European institutions, when they say what is a standardized test, they'll usually refer to university entrance exams like the SAT, but also some specific subject tests like the MAT or the LNAT or the STEP. And you'll be learning about those as we go on later on too. And university-specific tests that there are as well. So, for example, Bocconi, IE, Lewis also have these specific tests that are tailored to their own application itself for their university.
The SAT and the ACT are two major standardized tests that students take, particularly when they're applying to universities in the US. Of course, as mentioned earlier, they're also accepted by universities in the UK, Europe, and across the world, so they can be really a helpful supplement to your academic record, and quite a number of US universities do require them as part of the application, though lately we've seen a move towards most universities being SAT optional. There are various myths surrounding the process of standardized testing, the SAT and the ACT, so there is a need to dispel some of those myths. Some people will tell you that schools have a preference between the ACT and the SAT, and that is absolutely not true. Universities will accept whatever standardized test you submit to them. There is generally no need to prepare for both of them. There is various platforms that will offer you diagnostic tests that will sort of like give you a breakdown of what each test looks like and possibly help you decide which test best suits your abilities, your needs, and your level of study. Generally, you just need to submit one of them and not, you don't have to do both. You can actually test multiple times with each one of these tests. And some schools will take whichever test you performed best in the same sitting, but most schools will do what is called super scoring. So they'll actually take the best performance or the best scores that you've had in each section from the various tests that you've taken. There is sometimes a push for students to take the test as early as possible. However, that is also not always advisable. Some of the maths that you find in the SAT may be some information that you probably be doing in grade 10 maths, IM2 higher, that level. So it is generally okay to wait until you are at the level where you are most comfortable with at least the content material of the test, and before you can take it. Students generally tend to take the SAT during their junior year in grade 11 going into grade 12. You can, for regular decision, you can take it as late as December, just after our internal deadlines for the applications. Neither test is objectively easier than the other. That is something that sometimes students feel like, oh, maybe this test will be better than that one. Not necessarily. So preparing yourself and making sure that you take the test that best suits you and that you've best prepared for, it will save you much, much better than trying to do both or trying to figure out which test is easier than the other. They do vary slightly, which we're going to explore in the next slide. But at the end of the day, they both serve pretty much the same purpose. The SAT and the ACT are structured differently. So we'll start by looking at the SAT, which has one section which is reading and writing, then another section which is mathematics. So each of these sections will actually have 2 modules that you have to go through. On the other hand, the ACT has an English section that is 75 questions and 45 minutes. Then you have got a math section. After that you take a break, then you go to a reading section, then a science section. So that would be the difference there, in that the ACT does have a science section. Both of the tests actually have an optional writing section where you can write an optional essay. In terms of the scoring, the SAT, each of the 2 sections is marked out of 800 for a total of 1,600, whereas the ACT, each section is scored out of 36 points, and the composite score is also scored out of 36 points. Both of them are now available digitally. You do need to bring your own computer to the center for the SAT. However, for the ACT, the computer will be provided at the center. Cost-wise, the SAT will cost you around $104 plus an extra $30 if you register late. It's available on the College Board, whereas the ACT is slightly more expensive at $211.50, or if you're taking it without the optional writing section, it will be $186.50. Again, do check with the universities that you're looking to apply to so that you know whether you need that optional writing section or not. There are various test centers across London. We, of course, are a test center for the SAT. However, for those looking to take the SAT, they may need to consult a different testing center, Kingston Foundation School, and various other centers in London. Again, when you go into the global ACT website, these centers will be options. We're just highlighting them here. There are various test dates coming up in 2025. Of course, the March test date for the SAT. The February test date for the ACT has already passed, but there's another one in April, in June, going into September, October. So there's about 6 or so chances to sit for the SAT and the ACT before the next application cycle. Here we'll highlight various resources that students can use in their preparation for the SAT. You can always click on these on the slides. They'll be freely available. They're also available on our Schoology page. So there are various free services that you can use for your own study. If you are looking to do some tutoring, or we do offer a class, of course, here at ACS, which has already started. It's in full swing right now. We offer that class every year. Students can sign up for it. Again, at the end of the day, do your research, know what is required for the universities that you're applying for. Think about how the ACT or the SAT can help augment your academic reference or academic record. As for some students, it might be really be useful. Again, as mentioned earlier, even for UK schools, particularly those for students taking the APs, it can be useful, and it can sometimes be used in lieu of one AP. So do think about it, and if it is the right option for you, do go for it.
Okay, so for this part of the presentation, we're going to be looking specifically at the US. Firstly, whether or not to sit the SAT exam, and then secondly, to consider whether or not you should be submitting those results to the universities that you intend on applying to. So firstly, before we dive into those specific questions about whether or not to take the exam or whether or not to submit, it's really useful to get an overview of the type of terminology that you'll often see when it comes to standardized testing policies in the US. So that is centered around the SAT or the ACT. So the first one you'll see is test required. So that's when the SAT or ACT is mandatory as part of the application process. And these tend to be places that have state mandates for the results, for public universities specifically. So you will often see that for places in Texas, so UT Austin, Texas A&M, and Georgia specifically, so the University of Georgia or Georgia Tech. The second type of standardised testing policy will be test optional. So that's when the SAT or ACT is not necessarily required, but applicants can choose to submit them, and we'll talk about when those results are worthwhile submitting and when they enhance the application and perhaps when they don't so much. The third type is test flexible. So this is slightly confusing. It means that they do require a form of standardised testing, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the SAT or ACT. So for students that have, for example, already completed their APs or their IBs, you can submit that. What's difficult is the IB exams you take at the end of grade 12. So even though you could, in theory, take that or submit that instead of the ACT, you actually aren't able to do that because of the timing of when you apply. So in reality, it means either submitting AP results if you have them from grade 11 or SAT results. An example of those types of universities is actually Yale. And then the last one is a test blind policy. So that's when the SAT are not considered at all. Even if you submit them, they will not be viewed as part of the application process. So the biggest example of that is the University of California system. So if we just zoom out for a moment, the landscape has become increasingly confusing since COVID actually, but in the wider context of things, actually most universities continue to not require the SAT as part of the admissions process. So here Fair Test is an organisation that's campaigning for equitable and transparency with testing. They've said actually more than 80% of four-year colleges in the US do not require you to submit them for the application cycle that's just that we've just gone through. However, what we've seen is a return to requiring standardised testing for a number of universities, particularly those that are highly selective and very competitive to get into. So what we saw as part of the pandemic, where students couldn't take their SAT results, a lot of universities turned to test optional. So that would be if you can take it and you have a good score, you can submit it. But if you weren't able to take it or you don't want to submit it, you don't have to, and that would not affect your chances of application. So universities have had a chance to kind of trial that approach to admission. So seeing the first years coming in without SAT testing and seeing how they've done compared to previous years where they've required it. And some have felt that they have gained enough information from things like letters of recommendation from the high school record that they actually don't feel like it makes a difference. However, the highly selective university side of things, they've actually felt that the SAT gives them an interesting and useful data point to know which students that they feel will be, one, best prepared for the curriculum that they have, and two, will enable them to be successful once they have joined the university. So in the last few months, we've seen universities such as Johns Hopkins, Cornell, Stanford, University of Miami, and the University of Pennsylvania all return to requiring SAT testing or AC testing for the next application cycle. So for the grade 11s going into grade 12, those universities are going to be requiring it. Universities are, like I say, examining this on a kind of application by application cycle basis. So they can actually change their policy probably within 9 months. That's what we've seen now, 9 months in advance. So it's best to check for any university that you're looking at whether or not they do require it for the next application cycle, because they could have been test optional this year, but next year they may return to requiring it. Having said that, the SAT or ACT is not a primary factor which affects the decisions that most universities will make. So as you can see here, this is a survey from NACAT, which is an organisation looking at US admissions, and they asked colleges which areas of the admission process they rate as being the most important. So what do they tend to factor or place the most importance on when making a decision about whether or not to admit a student? And only 30% of colleges surveyed said that they were considered these tests to be of considerable or moderate importance. So there's a wide range of universities that feel that there's other ways that students can show their readiness to take on the curriculum at university. So to keep that in perspective, we need to think about how much resource and time that we allocate to taking these tests. Yes, they are required at some universities. That is a matter of fact. And in order to get into the certain ranges, which we'll look at the moment, that will require a considerable amount of prep. But you need to balance that against also taking your APs and IB and making sure that it doesn't take over. Obviously, your high school transcripts and the rigor of your high school record is always going to be more important than the SAT. The SAT is often something that triangulates, so that's another piece of evidence to say that you're performing at a certain level and you would be ready to take on the rigor and the level of challenge available at the university. So this graphic is actually a year or so out of date, but it's quite useful because it gives us an idea of, one, the acceptance or the admittance rate of a university, and then secondly, for the SAT, the 25th to 75th percentile that students enrolled at the university have been offering or submitting as part of their application. So it's just important to bear in mind, even within these ranges, so SAT out of 1600, at Georgetown, for example, you're having to score extremely highly, but even still, there's only a small chance, a less than 15% chance of admittance. So again, it's just balancing up where best to spend your time. If you're a student that's really good at taking tests and scores really highly, absolutely go for it. But bear in mind, there are plenty of universities that look at other things as well. When it comes to submitting your SAT score, we would recommend that students look up any universities that they are looking at applying to. One, checking the policy, but secondly, looking to see the particularly the 50 percentile. So the average SAT score, ACT score submitted, what is that score? And we would only recommend that you submit your score if you fall in that range or the range above that. Anything below that could harm your application. And I would particularly, for a test optional school, would suggest perhaps not submitting if your high school records, so your transcripts and your grades, show much stronger grades and performance than the SAT. That's what we would recommend, is to not submit those scores in those cases. So just to summarise, as we showed earlier, most colleges remain test optional, so you do have choice about whether or not to take those standardised tests. However, if you are applying to the US or fairly certain that you're applying to the US, we would definitely encourage you to take the exam at least once, preferably in grade 11. So there's 2 more sittings available this year in May and June, I believe. Or at the start, at latest at the very start of grade 12. It's a test that you will hear from others speaking in the presentation, that you have your scores that improve with practice. So it's a test that you learn to take and you can improve. So if you're really seriously considering the US, it would be worth factoring in to take the test twice, perhaps 3 times maximum. But there's no harm. We'd certainly encourage you to take it at least once, to have that anyway, because even if a university says they're test optional, you may find as part of a merit scholarship, so scholarship based off your kind of something that you're offering to the university, which could be really strong academics, that can really help your case for applying to merit scholarships or to honours colleges, so those more specialised, smaller programmes within larger universities, and that's where it can also be helpful. And then to recap in terms of whether or not to submit your SAT score, please work with your college counsellor. Think about the colleges that you're targeting. Think about the percentile that you fall within, and whether or not that the submission of the score will help you help your case. It will show a triangulation of strong academics, whether it will show maybe that you're outperforming in certain areas if you haven't perhaps done so well in maths at school, but your SAT score is stronger. That will certainly help your case. But if it falls lower than what you would see on your transcript, then it may be worth, in the case of test optional schools, not submitting those results.
So by now you're getting a sense of whether to sit or to not sit for the SAT exam, and whether you should be submitting or not submitting the exam for various universities. Let's look at the United Kingdom. If you are applying to the UK, and let's say you are an IB student, the SAT or ACT is never really required. Your admissions are based on your predicted scores, and your final IB results are what matter. Whereas if you are an AP student or a high school diploma student, Your SAT could be used in lieu of your AP exams, the various AP exams that you may have given. The SAT and ACT is expected by Cambridge University, but let's look at some examples of how universities evaluate the requirement of an SAT or ACT. Interestingly, as an AP student, it becomes really important for you to check the entry requirements when you're applying to any UK university. Imperial College London clearly specifies that they do not require the SAT or ACT. They do, however, require 3 to 4 AP exams to be given with a grade of 5 on each of those exams. This requirement may obviously vary from one course to the other. Oxford, on the other hand, will require the SAT or the ACT in lieu of a certain AP exam. You would also see the same thing with University of Surrey. And there is University of Newcastle, for example, that would actually specify the grade that is needed on every ACT or SAT exam. And depending on how many AP exams you need to sit for, that combination needs to be designed when you're looking at the entry requirements. So it becomes increasingly important for you to check these entry requirements before deciding on whether you need to sit for the SAT exam or not. So if you are an AP or US high school diploma student applying to the UK, it may be in your interest to sit the SAT or the ACT exam. And if you have indeed given your SATs, please go ahead and submit them. However, it's a little different when you're planning any European applications. Let's look at what are the SAT or SAT requirements for studying in Europe. The European Union or the Scandinavian belt has obviously a number of countries, a number of universities, and each of these universities may have very specific entry requirements. It becomes increasingly important for you to research before you decide on giving the SAT or the ACT. As a ballpark understanding, when it comes to being an IB student or an AP or high school diploma student, the SAT is rarely required by public universities. It is, however, understood that the SAT or ACT can sometimes be used to meet the minimum English or mathematics requirements at some of these universities. Also, you might find that some private universities, such as, let's say, the IE University or ESAT or Bocconi, or even the Stockholm School of Economics, they have their own entrance tests or admission tests, as you call them. These are used for admission to these universities. In case you have given the SAT exam, they can use the SAT score in lieu of these admission tests. So you might have a long list that you're applying to. And if you've given the SAT, you do not need to sit for multiple entrance exams at these universities, and you can just submit your SAT score. So once again, it becomes really important for you to evaluate what is your college list, how are you approaching your European applications, and then decide whether you really want to sit for the SAT exam. What also begins to happen is when you look at the rest of the world in terms of public universities and how they operate, Canada, for example, they never really require an SAT. However, it can be considered, like I do know of the University of British Columbia, that may consider the SAT if you have given it. Singapore, the SAT, ACT is required for some of the most competitive universities at Singapore, especially the NUS, NTU, and it's also definitely needed for AP and high school diploma students. Hong Kong, just like the UK, generally it can be used in lieu of an AP grade. So which means if you've given 2 AP exams and the SAT, that's what you can submit to Hong Kong universities. For Korea, it may be required for US high school diploma students and AP students. It's again dependent. It's very important to consider the actual entry requirements, and so is the case for Japan. Hope that clarifies.
So let's look at some other standardized tests. So here we got a wide range of additional tests beyond the SATs, ACTs, okay? They're usually quite specific according to where you're actually applying to. So the first one we've got here is the UCAT. The UCAT is for UK medicine and some other medical style related courses. So there's lots of information on the UCAT in the ucat.ac.uk. It is sat before the application. That's a point to note. And it's something that we also help support students prepare for in the Medic Society Club as well. So Mr. Singh goes through questions with the students that are looking to apply to medicine there. So UCAT, it takes quite a while to get prepared for that. The next one is LNAT. LNAT is for law. There are 9 UK universities that use the LNAT. The rest do not look at LNAT as part of the admissions process. These can be sat either before or after the application. It's generally quite a lot of abstract reasoning style questions in conjunction with kind of English understanding comprehension style questions. So there isn't an awful lot that needs to be done to prepare for that. Just using practice papers is usually how students prepare for that. There are some additional providers that we have got students in touch with in the past. The STEP is an advanced maths test used by 3 or 4 universities. That's usually sat after the application in grade 12 in the senior year in June. You will be contacted by the university as part of your conditional offer and told what steps are needed if this is you. The MAT test is also another advanced maths test used by 2 or 3 universities, usually sat in grade 12 in November. We used to have a series of these tests that were required to be done in a school, whereas now a lot of these now are being done virtually. So instructions are generally sent to you by universities that are requiring these tests. The ESAT is a newish test that has come out, which is used by Cambridge and Imperial, and you've got 2 separate testing dates there of October for Cambridge and January for Imperial. It's a test that is designed to test for your engineering and science admission tests for these 2 places. Different courses from these 2 universities will ask for the ESAT to be sat. The TMUA is a test for maths for university admissions, which is used by a range of universities that you can see there: Cambridge, Imperial, Warwick, Durham, LSE, sat in October or in January. And you have got a series of Oxford and Cambridge tests. These are course specific. These are the ones that are now delivered by Pearson. They used to be delivered in the school. Now they are done by Pearson, and they are all online. And then you have some university-specific tests for other places, such as Bocconi, IE. And there's also a Lewis test as well. So these are Spanish and Italian universities. What you'll find is they will also sometimes accept SAT in place of these university-specific tests. So it gives you a chance to work out which one you're doing better in. If you've got a really good SAT score, you could maybe look at trying to use that in place of one of these tests. They're very specific to the universities. You've also got specific tests in Humanitas University as well. So this is obviously one of those situations where you'll have to speak to your college counsellor because it's going to be specific to each individual person. And some Dutch numerous fixus programs will also have their specific tests as well, which they'll let you know that you need to do. Another thing, just while we're talking about the Netherlands to be aware of, is if you're not meeting the requirements for your maths, if you're, for example, doing like a standard level maths at IB, or you haven't done an AP calculus that may be required for one of their courses that you're applying to, then you've actually got these additional tests from the Boswell Institute, where you can demonstrate your maths ability as well. So that's something to work alongside your college counsellor with as well. So that brings us on to the English language testing. So there are a range of different English tests. These are usually predominantly for students where English is not their first language, or a university has deemed a student to be of a nationality of which they want additional testing. So these are IELTS, TOFEL, Duolingo is also one that can be used in some circumstances as well. So I'm just going to run through the circumstances of when you would want to sit or not to sit, or submit or not to submit an English language test. So English language tests, here are some general rules for these, okay? There are always exceptions to each of these rules, so, each individual university may have their slight nuances behind what they're requesting, and these can also change year on year, by the way, especially in UK universities. So, if you're in a situation where you have not been studying in a curriculum that is delivered in English for the last 3 to 4 years, for example, you may have come to ACS Cobham from another country where you were learning in a different language, and you arrive in grade 11, for example, so that means you'd only have 2 years, grade 11 and 12, in an English medium curriculum, then you're quite likely to need to take one of these English language tests. Additionally, if you are a non-native English speaker, then you may need to be doing one of these tests. If you're not doing IB, English language and literature, or you have no GCSE in English language, or you're enrolling on a foundation course at a UK university and you need a student visa, then an IELTS or something similar is often usually required. So this is a UK VI rule. Some students may be surprised when they're being asked to do an IELTS because they may have done 4 years in an English language curriculum like IB and doing a US high school diploma prior, yet a UK university may decide in order to meet the demands of the UK VI rules, needs to require an IELTS. Usually we recommend those students are doing an IELTS if you're applying to UK universities, because those IELTS tests can be used for the visa itself. Now, we have had a lot of exceptions to the rule here where students may think that they should not really be asked to demonstrate that they have got an English language proficiency with a test, because maybe they may have been in ACS for much longer than 4 years, for example. So previously I've had Dutch students whose English were absolutely fantastic and been here since grade 3 and been asked for an IELTS test. That's down to the actual university making that decision, because maybe they're trying to be like a little bit more cautious over the regulations and the UK VI looking at universities. So we've got a slight movement towards a bit more caution, and sometimes I would say a bit more of an unfair request for an IELTS, okay? So do bear that in mind, and if requested an IELTS, please don't be offended. It's just the UK universities trying to be extra cautious. Now, when we're looking at US universities, it's down to the university as well, or the college, to decide whether or not they can give you a language exemption with the test. However, usually speaking, they're happy to take IB, English language and literature as a course to bypass the requirement for a TOFEL or an IELTS. As well as maybe a GCSE in place of it as well. So let's look at like the list of those that are likely not required to take an English language test. If you have a passport of a nationality that is an English-speaking country, so there's a list of these, and it includes places such as South Africa and various Caribbean countries, US, Canada, UK, Ireland, New Zealand, Australia, and there's a few more in there as well, okay, where English is an official speaking language of the country. If you have, for example, been in an education system where English is delivered, as we've mentioned before, for 3 to 4 years, you may not be required to take the test, as well as we've said, doing the IB English test or GCSEs. So when to sit an English language test? There are always exceptions, remember, but we're just going to look at like UK and Europe. There is no need to sit before the application. So usually you will get a conditional offer, and if you are required to sit an IELTS or a TOEFL, then what will happen is they will stipulate that in the conditions, okay? So then you can do it afterwards. And so with the UK, in order to meet your conditions for your offer, you have to demonstrate that in the summertime. So as long as you've done it before the end of the summer. So with the US, Canada, Asia, typically you need to sit these before the application. So proof of a score uploaded or sent, or shortly after the application. So with the US, for example, we have a whole bunch of documents that we upload once you have submitted. The students, the deadline that US colleges give is the student's deadline, and then document uploading happens afterwards. So that gives you a little bit of a period of time where you may want to upload results of these tests afterwards. However, taking the test beforehand in order to get the results in time is something that we recommend. Same with Canada and universities in Asia, such as Hong Kong. So here are the key takeaways. It's very often specific according to which country or even which university you're applying to as to whether or not what rule applies to which standardized test that you're looking at. Okay, so this means that in grade 11, now is the time to get that research done. Research is key. The SAT and the ACT is just not going away. If anything, they're kind of making a comeback, as you've heard before, with some of these more highly selective universities starting to use these as data points. But it remains optional at most universities. Consider registering for the SAT or ACT, especially if you are an AP and high school diploma student. It can help you. Remember, you can actually sometimes with a UK application and you've got APs, use an SAT score in place of one of the APs. Okay, so just a little tip there. It's important to check your English language requirements of universities, especially if it's not a UK university, because you need to start being organised enough to whether or not you take a test before or after the application. With the UK, you just wait and see to see if they require your IELTS or not. However, if you're a non-native speaker of English and you've had less than 4 years, I would say speak to your college counsellor, look into how you can get your test, and do plan to have that test. Okay, so that's it for this presentation. Thank you very much for your time. Well done for getting through to the end. I appreciate your attention. And do remember, if you have any questions, please reach out to your college counsellor and we'll be only too happy to help.